The Invasive Thought by Shaun J. Nigro. You're not supposed to be able to dream in stasis. That much Sally knew, so she was a little unsettled upon discovering that she was, in fact, dreaming now. It's hard to say how long she'd been asleep, or on pause, as the rest of the Valley Forge crew liked to call it. She guessed a while, but there was really no way to measure time meaningfully. It may have been days before she realized she was dreaming. It was starting to feel like a lifetime. She didn't remember being put into stasis, but she vaguely recalled that there had been some troubling development in the ship's journey out of the solar system. She'd find out eventually, she hoped. A small part of her feared she might actually be dead. Perhaps this was her afterlife, a purgatory orchestrated by fragments of her last thoughts. She shuddered at this. It was a silly notion anyhow. She had a feeling she could not explain that her physical heart was softly beating in a cold but not entirely uncomfortable stasis chamber. Hers and the 13 other astronauts that had been put on pause until it was time for their wake cycle. When Sally went to sleep, in the living quarters where she would be sleeping during her actual wake cycle, she always woke the next morning with a start. She always seemed to forget, just for a moment, where she was. But when she had finally gathered her senses and remembered that she was still in her dream, strange thing to remember, by the way, she tried to go about her duties as if she were really awake. She found that this was the only way to pass the time in this place. It was the only thing that allowed her to distract herself from the fact that she was alone. In this dream, the others were not on the ship. There were no stasis chambers, and she could not access the second of 2 shuttle bays the crew inhabited for this mission. She could see it through the exterior cameras, but there did not even appear to be power to the ship as it drifted alongside Shuttle Bay 1 like a dead mosquito, proboscis lodged in skin. This was a gloomy thought. Another thought she thwarted with her mindless daily duties. Another peculiar thing was how small and dim the sun appeared to be. Sometimes she thought she could see right through it. She guessed this was a projection of what she had anticipated seeing eventually, as the ship, the real ship, sailed swiftly through space, further and further from home. Home. She wondered what her sister would be up to at that moment. Carly was a busybody, so she guessed on the phone with a client. She wondered if Carly had even noticed she'd left. Of course she knew. Everyone on Earth knew. But she and her sister had grown further apart over the last few years of training. She knew it was because Carly resented her for leaving. After all, her mother had not been well. The busybody had been given more work while Sally got to run off and be the hero astronaut. Some of this was speculation, since they had barely talked. Especially after the day their mother finally passed, she really couldn't be sure what Carly thought. Probably nothing at all. Probably working to stay distracted, like Sally had been doing this entire damned dream. "Roger that," Sally said through the comm system to herself. The boredom had her doing random stuff like that. She never answered herself, though, because she was mildly afraid that it might turn into a full-blown conversation, and she did not want to go crazy in a dream. Would she wake up crazy in that case? Would the infinite time passed here eventually grind away at her subconscious until, upon waking, she had outlived her body? "Hello?" Sally jumped out of her seat and spun towards the cockpit door. It had slid open, as it was supposed to do whenever one of the crew approached it. But she had been in her seat, far enough away that there was literally zero chance that she could have accidentally set the motion sensor off. She saw through to the hall, but it was empty. Still, she found her arm hairs had risen with the feeling that someone was standing there. Here it comes, Sally thought. Full-blown psychosis. Damn me and my Roger that's. The door slid closed, leaving Sally standing in silence, immaterial heart pattering in her chest. She'd felt this before, in nightmares, but so far this had not been a nightmare. Wouldn't that be something? Trapped in a nightmare for days. This particular feeling of someone or something being close by but not actually there was not unfamiliar to her. Ever since she was a girl, she'd occasionally have these dreams that she was not alone. She would wake up to her sister snoring in her bed on the other side of the room, and still the feeling from the dream lingered. Something was standing in the bedroom with them. Something that did not mean well. Then again, if there was really something there, it could have been benevolent, and Sally probably wouldn't know. She always remembered passages from the Bible where people were greeted by holy spirits, angels, they called them. Or was that from a movie? She never told anyone, but she secretly prayed to God, if he existed, she had remained agnostic most of her life, to not send her any angels. "Leave a note, please," she used to pray. "Don't startle me with your angels." And either God didn't exist, or he or she was kind enough to answer her prayers, at least in the physical sense. But she didn't think God would be cruel enough to send invisible angels to unsettle the bejesus out of her. That seemed like the work of the devil. And now, stuck in her dream, she was being forced to endure this dreaded feeling once more. She approached the door cautiously. Though she expected it, she was still startled when the door slid open from her own motion. She let out a deep breath. "Time for a snack, Sal." At the far end of the hall was the dining quarters. That was where she could see the translucent sun through a large reinforced window, or portal, as some of the crew called it. She found it odd that she could enjoy a snack in a dream, but it was a nice touch to the madness. Her brain had been considerate enough to remember the details of chocolate banana star bars. She wondered if she would ever grow tired of the flavor in the dream, but enjoyed it in the meantime. As she sat at the table chewing her star bar, gazing out into the vast emptiness of dream space, she had an idea. It was one she was surprised she hadn't yet thought of. What would happen to the trajectory of this dream if she forced her way off of the ship into that dream space? Would she just wake up back in the bed like a 2D video game character reappearing on the left side of the screen? She thought maybe it would be like in Monty Python's The Meaning of Life, where the character suddenly walked through the refrigerator into space for a musical number. But she swallowed her last bite of the star bar with a sudden feeling of terror. Maybe it would just turn into an endless nightmare of her falling through dream space. If the sun could become translucent out there, maybe her mind would see it fit to make her translucent until she completely vanished out of existence. Oh, interesting, she thought then. Then maybe I would just end the dream. If that happened, the time would continue to pass as it was supposed to in stasis until she found herself being awoken from her chamber as if no time had passed at all. Too much to ponder. She decided, after all, that she did not want to risk her dream becoming a nightmare, so she threw her Starbar wrapper in the nearby trash receptacle. Apparently cleanliness was another habit that would stick with her here, and went back to the cockpit to resume her duties until it was time to turn in. And it was after she had gotten comfortable, closing her eyes to usher in the next day, that she found herself experiencing something new for the first time since she had arrived in this place. She found herself within a new dream, except in this dream, much less vivid than the original dream, as if every new layer of a dream state became like a compressed version of the previous layer, a copy of a copy. She was outside the ship. She was not falling like she had feared she would, but she was perfectly still, staring back through the portal from the direction of the sun. Inside the ship, she saw herself staring back out at her, but seeming not to notice her existence. She was eating a star bar, lost in thought. She tried to scream, but when she opened her mouth, no sound came out. She tried to move, to wrap her hands against the reinforced glass of the portal, but she was frozen, motionless. She watched herself inside the ship throwing the Starbar wrapper into the nearby trash receptacle and then leave the room, never once noticing herself floating outside the ship. When Sally opened her eyes, she was back in her bed. She lay perfectly still, not stuck, but still grappling with the lingering feeling of being frozen. Perhaps that had been a projection of the feeling of being trapped in stasis, lying motionless and cold in a chamber back on the real ship. Her heart skipped a beat when she realized the door to the room was open. She turned her head to look through the doorway, but saw nothing unusual. But the foreboding feeling had returned. There was something standing in the room with her. "Hello?" Her voice was small and shaky. Silence. "Hello?" She tried again. The door slid closed, and, like the flame on a candlewick being pinched out, that dreaded feeling vanished. A loud explosion came from somewhere on the ship then, shaking the room and tossing her from her bed. The room continued to shake violently as she sat on the floor in terror, and then, all at once, everything was still again. Next to her bed, she saw a book had fallen to the floor. She did not remember having a book with her in this dream. She crawled across the room to retrieve it. A dog-eared paperback of War of the Worlds. The only person who would have had real books on the ship was her crewmate, Erica, who happened to be sharing her wake cycle with Caleb. Another projection? She didn't remember most of the books Erica read, so she found it odd that she would remember this one in particular. My brain is playing tricks on me, trying to scare me. The fear of encountering an alien species was a vague idea for Sally. All the supposed alien encounters on Earth had been debunked a million times over, and no signal or signs had yet to be discovered in the corners of space that Earth's scientists pointed their fancy satellites at. Space was big, but the probabilities of intelligent life being out there, at least anywhere nearby, had grown depressingly small. So why would a classic sci-fi novel about an alien invasion materialize now out of her own subconscious? Was that what that invisible thing was? Was she trying to warn herself? No, that didn't make sense. The feeling of not being alone had been with her in her waking life, since she was a child. She was mixing up memories and emotions from her past because she was tired of being in this damn dream. "Wake up, Sally!" Of course, she remembered she couldn't. She was dreaming in stasis after all. If she somehow managed to wake herself before her wake cycle, she would just be stuck in a cold stasis chamber. That would undoubtedly be worse. She laughed. The dream was getting to her. She had to keep a cool head, focus on her duties. Though time seemed irrelevant, it really was only a matter of it. Perhaps when she finally awoke and climbed out of her stasis chamber, she would forget the dream entirely, or at least the dream would fade into her subconscious like so many dreams before. She hoped so. Sally explored every foot of the ship to find the source of the blast that had shaken her from her bed, but there was nothing. Everything was as it had been the day before. Though, of course, it wasn't real, she even checked the ship's maintenance alerts. There was nothing that would indicate that anything had gone wrong. She sat, perplexed, in her chair in the cockpit. Well, that was 2 mysteries she could not solve. 3 if you count the invisible door-opening creature. What a tedious conundrum. She left the cockpit to find a star bar in the dining quarters. While enjoying her umpteenth star bar since she'd been in this dream place, she stared out the portal at the translucent sun. Another day in the mind of me. She thought about the dream she'd had the night before and guessed that had at least answered the question of what might happen to her outside the ship. Just thinking about the possibilities had expanded the nature of this dream, and she prayed that that would be the last of it. I will not leave this ship if it's the last thing I do. Ping! Sally looked up at the comm speaker. That had been a message alert. She left her star bar half-eaten next to the wrapper on the table and ran for the cockpit, where a blinking green light indicated an Earth origin signal. A message from Earth in her dream. This ought to be good. She sat down in her chair and took a deep breath, bracing herself for what she might hear. When she felt she was ready, she reached a finger to a button on the console and pressed it softly. At first, there was only silence. Then, there was a clear voice. The Columbia Broadcasting System and the affiliated stations present Orson Welles and the Mercury Theater on the air in The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. It was the famous Orson Welles radio dramatization of War of the Worlds. The broadcast seemed to be growing louder. Sally started to reach for the button to end the transmission, but the broadcast suddenly cut out. We interrupt this broadcast to bring you an important message from our sponsor, an old-timey voice said, seriously. There was a short pause and then, Roger that. Sally's voice came through the speaker. She backed away from the console quickly. What the hell is going on? She was startled by the door opening behind her, but realized she had activated it from backing so far across the room. The next time Sally closed her eyes in bed, she opened them again to find herself walking through the corridors of the ship. It was as if someone, or thing, had decided to start the dream within a dream for her. She observed herself traversing the ship through her own mind, as if her body were the cart of an amusement park track. Here's where we shit and our excrements are ejected into space, where it freezes and drifts into the eons. Here's where we eat star bars and never gain weight, because the seed intelligence module ensures we maintain a strict regimen of exercise and shitting. At that, her body turned into the dining quarters, where there was still a half-eaten star bar on its wrapper from the day before. She sat at the table, upper body erect, and stared at the star bar. What is this? Is there a me inside the star bar? She laughed. The star bar started to pulsate on the table. Some of the granola bits rolled off, away from the wrapper, as a thick red substance oozed out of any crevice it could find. The pulse quickened, and the star bar appeared to be expanding until, pow! The star bar exploded, and Sally jolted upright in her bed, sweating and panting feverishly. She looked down at her forearms and saw that they were beet red, pulsating. She thought of all the times on Earth she had fallen asleep on a limb in an unnatural position, finding the feeling translated to elements of her dreams, and then waking up to numbness or a pins and needles sensation. Her arms seemed to be engorged with blood now. She saw her veins become more pronounced as her forearms dropped to her lap, feeling impossibly heavy. She moved to the edge of the bed, but her forearms felt like weights on her groin. She tried to scream out, but her voice was gone. On the floor, she saw her mysterious copy of War of the Worlds, the pages fluttering with some unseen force. She had a sensation not unlike trying to recall a word at the tip of your tongue, some thoughts or experience that you felt you knew but could not conjure when you needed it most. She looked down at her forearms to find that they had grown to resemble Popeye the Sailor Man's, and the skin on her vein-ridden wrists began to split from the middle. She opened her mouth to pantomime a scream, but still there was no sound. Her wrists split wider as slimy, dark bulges pushed slowly out. The skin contoured to the shape of the bulges, sliding away slightly with every enlarged pulse. Sally saw now that the blackness forcing its way out of her arms was sentient. As her skin fell away into flaps of viscous flesh, she recognized the faces that formed from the sharpened grooves and crevices of the bulges. It was as if she was staring at a fleshless mirror reflection of herself. And then she was herself again. She woke up, not daring to move. She vaguely recalled the door to the room swooshing open, but she was afraid to look. "Hello?" she tried. Silence. Sally spent the rest of the day on edge, not daring to look down at her wrists. Around every corner she expected to see something. Anything. Maybe that made it worse, not knowing what it was that might be in the darkness, waiting for you. That thought made looking out the portal less enticing. Today, she told herself, she resolved to keep her head down except where she needed to see ahead, though she was sure she could accomplish her day's duties blindfolded at this point. Ignoring her surroundings, dialing deeper into her duties, Sally found the day transpired without much of a hitch. In fact, things went as smoothly as they had gone the first few days, before she had come to the realization that she was dreaming. When she thought that she had at last conquered the dream and successfully blocked out the invasive nightmare thoughts, the paranoid feeling returned. As she was making her way back to the sleeping quarters, she realized she had passed a door that was already open. It was the door to the dining quarters. She stopped a few feet past it and swallowed hard, feeling her skin prickle up with goosebumps. There was no sound of the door closing. No sound at all. She turned slowly, curiosity overtaking the fear that ignited her heart rate. As she approached the door, she thought she heard a crinkling sound and intuitively pushed her tongue back further into her throat. A couple times when she was younger, she had accidentally bit her own tongue upon being startled by some jump scare in a movie. She had learned quickly to brace herself for such a scare when she could. That would not save her in the event of a real emergency, but at least her tongue would remain unscathed. "I know there's someone there." She moved slowly, but waited for a response. "I know I'm not alone in here." The dining quarters came into view as she turned the corner. Are you real?" she started to say, before realizing that there was actually someone sitting at one of the tables. Though her back was turned, the woman was familiar, eating a Star Bar, staring through the portal out into that vast nothingness. The woman turned to face her, smiling, and Sally stumbled back at the sight of her own face. The resemblance was uncanny, but it was somehow not completely her own. The door slid closed and reopened again to reveal the woman standing in front of Sally. Sally stood her ground, shaking, as the woman started to reach a hand toward her face. The fingertips touched her skin, brushing a strand of hair aside. They were cold and damp, and she could feel her doppelganger's breath, also cold, as she traced the contours of her skin. The woman opened her mouth and tried to speak, but seemed to struggle with sounding out the syllables. Finally, her tongue touched the top of her mouth and formed a drawn-out s sound, but lost the word again. While attempting this, her eyes remained transfixed on Sally's, like she was trying to understand something about her. Her pupils were large, and the blackness made them look like they had been carved from the empty space through the portal behind her. The woman tried again, her fingers gliding down over Sally's chin now. She continued, drawing out every letter. Her hand lurched at Sally's throat, tight around her esophagus, and she pulled Sally closer. "Sally!" She struggled, but her doppelganger's grip grew tighter. The eyes remained vacant, not menacing, but observant. "Sally!" the woman said again, this time more clearly. The woman released her grip on Sally's throat and stepped back, blinking once. The door slid closed. When it opened again, the room on the other side was empty. Sally spent the rest of what would have been her night sitting upright in her bed. She flipped through the pages of Erica's dream copy of War of the Worlds, stopping only to observe the odd passage and illustrations that had been included in this edition. How did this one end? She flipped through to a page near the end of the story and started a new passage. And scattered about it, some in their overturned war machines, some in the now rigid handling machines, and a dozen of them stark and silent and laid in a row, were the Martians, dead, slain by the putrefactive and disease bacteria against which their systems were unprepared, slain as the red weed was being slain, slain after all man's devices had failed by the humblest things that God, in his wisdom, had put upon this earth. It was something microscopic that had, after all, destroyed the invading creatures in the story. It was not unlike how centuries of colonizers on Earth had unwittingly, except where explicitly intended, contributed to the death of so many within the conquered civilizations. Except in the real world, the disease came from the more advanced colonizers. It was not so much the disease and bacteria part that stuck with Sally upon reading this passage, but the fact that a microscopic thing could so swiftly decimate an entire species. In a sense, the ETs in the story were to eventually be completely subsumed by the bacteria within Earth's atmosphere, the bacteria which, to the human eye, was invisible. Sally looked up from the book and thought of all the times she had felt a presence in the room with her, but could not see it. Was this a microscopic entity? Had she carried this entity with her onto the ship, and was it only just now able to grow and exact its wrath? But nothing survives in space, at least unaided. Except maybe tardigrade. Was her brain being eaten by carnivorous tardigrades? Little bastards. She laughed out loud. She thought again that she might be making too much of this. It was likely that her brain was reacting to a fear response from feeling trapped in a dream state within stasis. Of course she was going to panic eventually, and all that built-up anxiety was going to seep into her subconscious. Microscopic subconscious mumbo-jumbo. Her thoughts trailed off as her eyes grew heavy. It would be morning soon, but the exhaustion had caught up with her and, for the first time in a long time, she fell into a dreamless sleep. When Sally next awoke, she was shaking from the cold. The ship's temperature had dropped significantly, though no maintenance or malfunction alarm sounded. She shook a hand that had grown numb from falling asleep on it and gathered her senses. It was strange waking up feeling fully rested, but it didn't take long for the anxieties and harrowing reality of her dream life to settle back in. The book had fallen to the floor, but she noticed the words had been blurred, like she was censoring her own dream life. She stood and felt her stomach growl, but she feared returning to the dining quarters. Hunger could not kill her here, but she did not look forward to spending however much time there was left with an empty stomach. She realized then that she hadn't actually been hungry the entire time she had been in this place. The food merely satiated her boredom. So why now? Why am I experiencing hunger? Was it anxiety? Either way, the hunger was becoming almost unbearable. Her mouth salivated as she thought about the star bars. But I can't go back there, can I? She wondered if her doppelganger was still sitting there, waiting for her, though she remembered she had disappeared. She could be anywhere. That settled it, assuming her doppelganger was the unseen presence that had been opening doors around the ship. Or maybe my guardian angel? Some timing you got there, Mr. Angel. She keeled over a little as a sharp pain shot through her gut. She had to eat. Unfortunately, the dining quarters were at the far end of the corridor from where she was, so she walked as quickly as she could while holding her stomach, the pain growing worse by the second. She found it hard to focus her thoughts as she passed doors to rooms that had remained thus far vacant. Mashed potatoes and gravy, shepherd's pie, 3 cheese tortellini, portobello mushrooms. A barrage of recipes fluttered through her mind in the hopes that she could, for once, conjure something other than a star bar. Strawberry short. She stopped. One of the doors she passed had slid open, and then another, or had the first door closed again? The sound of another door opening, and another. She turned to find all of the doors in the corridor had slid open. Hello? As if on cue, familiar faces began to step forward from the once vacant rooms. Every single face that appeared was her own, all with the same vacant look as the doppelganger that had grabbed her throat. "Sally," one of them spoke. "Sally," another said, struggling like the first doppelganger had. "Sally," they all said at once. They all appeared to be gritting their teeth as if they were attempting to smile. They started walking toward her, continuing to smile, never blinking. "Sally!" they were shouting now. Sally turned in the direction of the dining quarters and stood straight, trying her best to ignore the pain in her stomach. She started running as fast as she could, and she could hear her doppelganger's feet pick up pace as well. The dining quarters door slid open, and she ran to the nearest table to grab a chair. The tables themselves were bolted to the floor. Next to the door was a control module, where the wiring for the motion sensors could be accessed. Lacking any tools, she swung the chair as hard as she could into the module. After the third swing, the panel broke open, and she reached in to yank the wires out. The spark knocked her on her feet as the door slid half-closed and open multiple times, as if it were unsure of what it wanted to do. Finally, the door slid fully closed, and she could hear the pounding of fists on the other side. "Sally!" they continued to scream. Though she wasn't sure she had a choice, she could not continue to live like this. The paranoia and anxiety was destroying her from within. She would go out on her own terms. She pushed herself to her feet and searched the cabinets for a Star bar, surprised at finding a new flavor, strawberry shortcake. At least she had control over something. But she knew the doppelgangers would not go away. Not this time. Her fears had grown insurmountable. There were too many of them, and the door would not hold them forever. Already she could see the metal bulging from the repeated pounding of fists that probably could not even feel pain. Sally turned to look out the portal. The sun was still translucent. She found herself thinking of death and the light at the end of a tunnel. You're not supposed to go toward that light. Was this her tunnel? Was she really just refusing to let herself die? Had this entire dream just been a construct, her mind's way of shielding her from the inevitable? There's only one way to find out. She finished her Star bar and threw the wrapper on the table, keeping her eyes fixed on the fading sun. She grabbed a chair and raised it over her head. Time to wake up, Sal. Approaching the glass as fast as she could, she swung the chair hard, forcing the chair to shatter into pieces, but the glass remained uncracked. She grabbed another chair and swung harder. Still, nothing. Behind her, the doppelganger seemed to be having more luck as the repeated pounding forced the door to give way. "Sally!" Sally grabbed the last chair and raised it high. "That's my fucking name, all right!" She swung with her last bit of strength, and finally the glass gave way. The shards were immediately sucked into the abyss. She turned to face her doppelgangers as they charged menacingly toward her, still awkwardly smiling through gritted teeth. She smiled back and let herself fall out of the ship, a sensation of being whisked away like a carnival ride overtaking her body. Her doppelgangers stood staring as they shrank with the ship, falling further away into the distance. And then she woke up. Through the glass of the stasis chamber, Sally could see a dim light. It was one of the overheads in the room where the chambers were kept. She felt a gust of warm air as the lid to her chamber popped open, revealing a room she thought she had always been in. "We worried you weren't going to make it," Erica, the real Erica, spoke from a seat next to the chamber. "How long was I out?" "Normal time, about a month, but, well, we'll talk about it when you're fully awake." "Oh." Sally looked around the room. She could see the other stasis chambers opening and her crewmates coming out of their own days. "We gotta perform the medical checklist, if you're ready." "I think I am." "Okay, how many fingers am I holding up?" Sally looked at Erica's hand. "3. What is the name of the ship you are on? The Valley Forge. Good. And what is your name? Sally winced as a sharp pain surged through her head, causing her vision to double for a second. She looked back at Erica. Sally, she smiled. Of course.